I still remember the day Mama packed my suitcase. "You'll thank us one day," she whispered, not meeting my eyes. "When the church makes you a good girl." Through the window, rain drummed against our small farmhouse, and I watched Papa load my battered case into the back of Reverend Miller's black sedan. I was 7 years old, and I didn't know that the next 10 years would teach me more about hell than heaven. I didn't know that behind those towering stone walls, holiness wore a mask, and I certainly didn't know that one stormy night, fire would become my salvation, burning away lies and setting the truth free. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that rainy morning in 1952, when my childhood ended and my survival began. The ride to St. Catherine's took nearly 3 hours through winding mountain roads. I sat in the back seat, my Sunday shoes pinching my feet, clutching the cloth doll Mama had sewn for my 6th birthday. Reverend Miller didn't speak much, just hummed hymns under his breath while his windshield wipers fought against the downpour. I pressed my face to the cold window, watching our farm disappear into the mist, wondering when I'd see it again. Mama had said it would be just for a while, until they could afford to keep me fed through the winter. Times were hard after Papa's accident at the mill. His mangled hand meant less work, less money, less food on our table. The church school offered free room and board for children whose families couldn't manage. They called it charity. They called it God's blessing. When we finally pulled up to St. Catherine's, my breath caught in my throat. The building rose from the hillside like something from a storybook. All gray stone and narrow windows, with a bell tower that pierced the low clouds. Moss clung to the walls, and ivy crawled up toward the crosses that marked every corner. It looked ancient and holy and somehow wrong, though I couldn't have explained why at 7 years old. The iron gates groaned as Reverend Miller pushed them open, and suddenly I didn't want to leave the car. I wanted to tell him to turn around, to take me back to Mama and Papa, and our drafty little farmhouse, where at least I knew what each day would bring. But good girls didn't make a fuss. Good girls did what they were told. Sister Margaret met us at the heavy oak doors. She was tall and thin, her face framed by a starched white wimple that made her look severe. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she thanked Reverend Miller and took my hand in her cold, dry grip. "Come along, child," she said, her voice crisp as the autumn air. "We have prayers before supper, and you're already late." She led me through corridors that seemed to stretch forever, our footsteps echoing off stone floors. The smell hit me immediately, a mixture of candle wax, old wood, and something medicinal I couldn't name. Oil paintings of saints lined the walls, their painted eyes following us as we walked. I clutched my doll tighter. The dormitory held 20 narrow beds, each with a thin mattress and gray wool blanket. The other girls barely glanced at me when Sister Margaret announced I'd be sleeping in bed 14, between a freckled girl named Mary and a dark-haired child who kept her eyes on the floor. "Unpack quickly," Sister Margaret instructed. "Then Mary will show you to the chapel. We don't tolerate tardiness at St. Catherine's. Discipline is how we honor God." She left, her rosary beads clicking against her belt as she walked away. The moment the door closed, Mary turned to me with wide green eyes. "Don't cry at night," she whispered urgently. "They hear everything, and crying means extra penance." I nodded, not understanding, but sensing the fear beneath her words. That first evening, I learned the rhythm of St. Catherine's prayers at 5 in the morning. So early the sky was still black. Cold porridge for breakfast, eaten in silence while Sister Margaret read from Scripture. Then lessons, cleaning duties, more prayers, thin vegetable soup for lunch, more lessons, more prayers, and a small piece of bread with weak tea for supper. We were in bed by 7, lying in the dark, while Sister Margaret walked between the rows, making sure no one spoke or moved. I lay there that first night, homesick and confused, listening to the old building creak and settle around us. Somewhere down the hall, a girl was crying softly, trying to muffle the sound. I thought of Mama tucking me in, of Papa's rough hand smoothing my hair. I thought of home until sleep finally claimed me. The days blurred together quickly. I learned that mistakes had consequences. Spilling your water meant kneeling on dry corn kernels for an hour. Speaking during silent time meant copying Bible verses until your hand cramped. Looking up during prayers meant standing in the cold hallway without supper. The punishments seemed designed to hurt, just enough to teach you, but not so much that you could complain. After all, they'd say, we were being corrected with love. We were being shaped into vessels worthy of God's grace. The bruises on our knees and the hunger in our bellies were just part of becoming good. But it was the nights that taught me real fear. Sometimes, After Sister Margaret's final rounds, we'd hear footsteps in the hallway, heavy footsteps that didn't belong to the nuns. Doors would open quietly, and in the morning, one of the older girls would have red eyes and wouldn't speak at all during breakfast. We younger ones didn't understand at first, but we learned not to ask questions. Questions led to punishment. Silence kept you safer. Mary, who'd been at St. Catherine's for 2 years already, explained it to me one afternoon while we scrubbed the chapel floor. The priests say they're checking on us, she said quietly, her brush moving in careful circles. They say they're making sure we're pure. But Sarah, you have to understand, if they ever come to your bed, you stay still and you don't tell anyone. Because telling means you invited it. Telling means you're wicked. That's what happened to Elizabeth. I asked who Elizabeth was. Mary's hand stilled on the brush. She told, and then she was gone. Winter settled over St. Catherine's like a heavy shroud, bringing snow that piled against the windows and a cold that seeped through the stone walls. No matter how many layers we wore, the building had a heating system. But Sister Margaret said that learning to endure discomfort built character. We shivered through our lessons, our fingers stiff and clumsy as we tried to write. Chilblains appeared on our hands and feet, angry red marks that itched and burned. When I showed mine to Sister Margaret, she told me to pray for strength and gratitude. There were children who had no roof at all, she reminded me. We were blessed. Bafna became my closest friend during those frozen months. She was 9, 2 years older than me, and had been sent to St. Catherine's when her mother died and her father took work on a fishing boat up north. She had a quick smile despite everything, and she knew all the ways to make life a little more bearable. She showed me which spots in the courtyard got a few minutes of afternoon sun, where we could warm ourselves during our brief recreation time. She taught me how to make my porridge last longer by eating it slowly, one tiny spoonful at a time, tricking my stomach into feeling fuller. She told me stories at night, whispering them so quietly I had to strain to hear. Stories about princesses and adventures and worlds far away from stone walls and endless prayers. Mary gave me hope that maybe, somehow, we'd survive this. But St. Catherine's had a way of stealing hope. The rules seemed designed to break something inside us. We couldn't laugh too loudly or we'd be accused of frivolity. We couldn't ask for seconds at meals or we'd be called gluttonous. We couldn't prefer one friend over another or we'd be guilty of exclusive affection, which they said led to sinful attachments. Everything natural about being a child was labeled as wrong, something to be corrected, purified, beaten out of us with rulers and belts and hours of kneeling on hard floors. They told us our parents had sent us here because we were difficult children who needed discipline. They told us we should be grateful for their attention, their correction. They told us that suffering brought us closer to Christ. Father Joseph ran St. Catherine's with an iron fist hidden in a velvet glove. He was a large man with silver hair and a voice that could boom through the chapel, or drop to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening. He smiled often, especially when visitors came, showing them our neat rows in the dining hall, our memorized prayers, our spotless chapel. He'd place his heavy hand on our shoulders and call us his flock, his little lambs. But after the visitors left, that same hand would grab your arm hard enough to bruise if you'd smiled wrong or answered a question poorly. Father Joseph had a study on the second floor where children were sometimes called for private conferences. We all learned to dread the sound of our name being announced at breakfast. Sarah, Father Joseph would like to see you after morning prayers. Your stomach would drop, your breakfast would turn to ash in your mouth, and you'd spend the whole prayer service trying not to shake. I was called to his study on a Tuesday in January. I remember, because it was Mary's birthday, and we'd been planning to save our bread from lunch to give her an extra portion at dinner, a small celebration. But when Sister Margaret announced that Father Joseph wanted to see me, Mary's face went pale. She squeezed my hand under the table, just once, quickly. After prayers, I climbed the worn stairs to the second floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. I knocked on his door with a trembling hand. "Enter," his voice called out, warm and welcoming. The room was warmer than anywhere else in St. Catherine's, with a fire crackling in the fireplace and thick rugs on the floor. Father Joseph sat behind a massive desk, papers spread before him. He smiled as I entered. "Close the door, child. We need privacy for our talk." What happened in that room stayed locked inside me for decades. I learned that day what the older girls had known, why their eyes went dead. why some of them stopped eating and wasted away until they were taken somewhere else. I learned that prayers could be twisted into weapons, that trust could be shattered in minutes, that your own body could become a source of shame you'd carry forever. When I finally left his study, my legs barely held me. Sister Margaret was waiting in the hallway. She looked at my tear-stained face and disheveled dress and said simply, "Clean yourself up, and remember, bearing false witness is a mortal sin." I understood. This would be my secret to carry. My burden. My fault. I changed after that day. Mary noticed immediately. She tried to talk to me, but I couldn't find words for what had happened. How do you explain that the man who preached about God's love had taught you only about power and helplessness? How do you describe the feeling of your faith cracking apart like ice on a frozen pond? I stopped volunteering answers and lessons. I stopped hoping that someone would come rescue us. I learned what the other girls already knew. We were alone here, and survival meant making yourself small and quiet and trying not to be noticed. The seasons turned. Spring brought rain and mud. Summer brought stifling heat to our airless dormitory. Fall brought colder nights again. I turned 8, then 9. New girls arrived, looking scared and hopeful. I watched them learn the same lessons I'd learned, saw their spirits dim the same way mine had. Some girls left, sent back to families who could afford them again, or transferred to other institutions. We never knew which. They'd simply be gone one morning, their bed stripped, their name never mentioned again. When Mary asked about a girl who'd disappeared overnight, Sister Margaret slapped her hard across the face and made her stand in the corner for 3 hours. We learned not to ask. Life at St. Catherine's was a strange mixture of numbing routine and sudden violence. Days could pass in monotonous sameness, the same prayers and chores and thin meals. Then suddenly you'd be grabbed, struck, locked in the cold cellar for an infraction you didn't understand. Father Joseph would be kind one week, handing out peppermints after Mass, and cruel the next, making children stand with arms outstretched holding heavy books until they collapsed. There was no logic to it, no way to predict safety. That unpredictability was its own form of torture, keeping us always on edge, always afraid, always trying to be good enough to avoid the next punishment. The winter I turned 10 was the hardest. Food became even scarcer as St. Catherine's faced financial troubles. None of the children understood, but all of us felt. Our portions shrank. The porridge became more water than oats. Sometimes there was no supper at all, just a cup of broth and a prayer about fasting bringing us closer to God. We were always hungry, always cold, always tired. Mary got sick that winter, a cough that settled deep in her chest and wouldn't leave. Sister Margaret said she was being dramatic, seeking attention, but I could hear Mary struggling to breathe at night, could feel the heat of fever radiating from the bed next to mine. I begged Sister Margaret to let me take Mary to see the doctor in town. She told me Mary would be fine with prayer and rest. God heals the faithful, she said. I prayed until my knees bled from kneeling on the stone chapel floor. God didn't answer. One morning in February, Mary didn't wake up. I shook her shoulder gently, then harder, then desperately. Her skin was so hot it burned my hand, but she wouldn't open her eyes. I screamed for help, breaking the sacred silence of mourning, not caring about punishment. Sister Margaret came running, and for just a moment, I saw something like fear cross her face. She sent another girl running for Father Joseph while she tried to rouse Mary, but my friend, my only friend in that terrible place, was gone. They took her body away that afternoon. Father Joseph led a brief prayer service, speaking about angels and God calling his children home. He made it sound beautiful, peaceful. He didn't mention that they'd let her die rather than spend money on a doctor. He didn't mention that her cough could have been cured with medicine and proper food. He didn't mention that at 10 years old, Mary had been worked and starved and broken until her body simply gave up. They buried her in a small cemetery behind St. Catherine's, where other children lay in graves marked only with simple wooden crosses. I wasn't allowed to attend the burial. Children weren't permitted at funerals, they said. It would disturb us. Instead, I was given Mary's chores along with my own, doubling my workload. That night, lying in bed staring at her empty mattress, something inside me crystallized into a hard, cold certainty. This place was evil. These people, who spoke of God's love and mercy, who wore crosses and led prayers, were not holy. They were monsters dressed in black robes, and if I stayed here much longer, I would end up like Mary, forgotten, in an unmarked grave. But what could a 10-year-old girl do? I had no money, no way to contact my parents, nowhere to run even if I could escape. The nearest town was miles away, down a mountain road. Winter still held the land in its grip. Running would mean freezing to death, and I was too much of a coward to choose death over continued survival. So I stayed. I kept my head down. I did my chores, and said my prayers, and tried not to feel anything at all. Feeling meant hurting, and I'd already hurt more than I thought possible. Spring finally came, bringing longer days and the slow thaw of snow. With it came someone new to St. Catherine's. Sister Agnes arrived on a Wednesday morning, introduced by Father Joseph as a transfer from a convent in Boston. She was younger than the other nuns, maybe 30, with gentle eyes that actually looked at us like we were human children rather than problems to be managed. During her first breakfast with us, she noticed how quickly we ate, how we hunched protectively over our bowls. She noticed the bruises on our arms, the way we flinched when adults moved too quickly near us. I saw her notice, and for the first time in years, something like hope flickered in my chest. Sister Agnes taught our afternoon lessons, and her classroom felt different from the start. She didn't yell when we made mistakes. She didn't hit our hands with rulers when our penmanship wasn't perfect. She encouraged questions, praised efforts, smiled when we got answers right. The other children slowly, cautiously began to relax around her, but I stayed wary. I'd learned that kindness could be a trap, that trust led to betrayal. I watched Sister Agnes carefully, looking for the crack in her gentle facade, waiting for her to reveal the cruelty I knew must be hiding underneath. It took months before I let my guard down even slightly. Sister Agnes was patient, never pushing, always steady. She'd slip extra bread into my pocket after lessons. She'd place her hand gently on my shoulder when I struggled with an assignment. Her touch careful and brief. Nothing like Father Joseph's grabbing hands. She'd find me in the courtyard during recreation and sit beside me, not forcing conversation but offering quiet companionship. Slowly, carefully, she built a bridge between us made of small kindnesses and genuine respect. One evening in late summer, I was in the chapel alone, supposed to be polishing the brass candlesticks, but instead just sitting in a pew, staring at the crucifix above the altar. I was thinking about Mary, wondering if there really was a heaven and if she'd found it, or if death was just nothing, an end to suffering, but an end to everything else too. I didn't hear Sister Agnes enter until she slid into the pew beside me. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Faith is never meant to hurt, child. I turned to look at her, and she was crying, tears running down her cheeks, unchecked. What's happening here? What they're doing to you children? This isn't God's will. This is sin dressed up in holy words, and I promise you, I'm going to stop it. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt terror, because I knew what happened to people who tried to fight back at St. Catherine's. They disappeared. They got transferred. They ended up like Mary. You can't, I whispered urgently. They'll hurt you. They'll make you leave. Sister Agnes took my hand in both of hers. Then they'll have to make me leave. But I won't go quietly, and I won't go without making sure you're all safe first. I've been writing letters, documenting what I've seen. I have friends outside these walls, people in the church hierarchy who will listen. This is going to end. Sarah, I swear it on my soul. Sister Agnes became more bold after that conversation. She started asking questions in community meetings about the children's health, about our meager food rations, about the frequency of punishments. Father Joseph initially dismissed her concerns with charm, calling her tender-hearted, saying she'd understand the necessity of strict discipline once she'd been here longer. But Sister Agnes didn't back down. She pushed harder, her questions becoming more pointed. Why were there no medical records for the children? Why did the financial ledgers show incoming donations that never seemed to translate into better conditions? Why were some children called to private meetings with male staff members behind locked doors? The tension in St. Catherine's grew thick enough to choke on. Father Joseph's smiles became strained. Sister Margaret watched Sister Agnes with open hostility. The other nuns avoided her, afraid of being associated with her rebellion. But Sister Agnes continued, and she enlisted us children as silent witnesses. She'd find us privately, one by one, and ask gentle questions. She never pressed if we weren't ready to talk, but she made it clear she was listening if we could find the courage to speak. A few of the older girls began telling her their stories, whispering the truths we'd all been forced to bury. Sister Agnes wrote it all down in a leather journal she kept locked in her room. I was in the courtyard one October afternoon, supposed to be weeding the garden, When I heard raised voices from Father Joseph's office window above, I crouched behind a bush, listening. Father Joseph's voice, no longer warm and welcoming, was cold and sharp as a blade. "You're making serious accusations, Sister Agnes. Accusations that could destroy reputations, damage the church's standing in this community. I suggest you reconsider your position." Sister Agnes's reply was steady. "I'm not making accusations, Father. I'm stating facts. Facts I can prove with records and testimonies. These children are being abused physically, emotionally, and some of them sexually. This institution is corrupt, and I will not be silent about it." The silence that followed was terrifying. Then Father Joseph spoke again, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet I recognized from his study. "You understand that if you pursue this, you'll be removed from your position. Your reputation will be destroyed. No one will believe a hysterical young nun over a priest with 30 years of service. You'll accomplish nothing except ruining your own future." Sister Agnes didn't hesitate. "Then my future is a small price to pay for their safety. I've already sent copies of my documentation to the bishop. This conversation is over." I heard footsteps, a door slamming. I stayed hidden behind the bush, my heart hammering, knowing that everything was about to change. That night, Sister Agnes was moved from her room near our dormitory to a small cell in another wing. She was forbidden from teaching us or speaking to us without supervision. Father Joseph announced during evening prayers that Sister Agnes was ill and needed time for spiritual reflection and recovery. He asked us to pray for her. I saw the warning in his eyes. Sister Agnes had challenged him, and now she was being isolated, punished, made into an example. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who rebel. The next few weeks were tense and strange. We barely saw Sister Agnes except at Mass, where she sat with the other nuns but apart somehow, her presence creating an uncomfortable bubble of space. The other children whispered about her, some grateful that someone had tried to help, others resentful that her efforts had made things worse. Because things did get worse, Father Joseph and Sister Margaret cracked down on us with renewed vigor. As if proving their authority, punishments increased, food rations decreased, the atmosphere became even more oppressive, if such a thing was possible. I lay awake at night wondering if Sister Agnes regretted speaking up, if she wished she'd just kept quiet and survived like the rest of us learned to do. November brought early snow and shorter days. The building felt darker, colder, more prison-like than ever. Then came the night that changed everything. It started with a storm. One of those fierce mountain storms that seemed to shake the very foundations of St. Catherine's. Wind howled around the corners, rattling windows in their frames. Rain turned to sleet, then snow, then back to rain. Thunder cracked so loud it set my teeth on edge. We were in our dormitory, all 20 of us huddled in our thin blankets, when the lights flickered and went out. The darkness was absolute, thick, and suffocating. Girls whimpered in fear. Sister Margaret's voice cut through the dark. "Silence. Stay in your beds. The power will return shortly." We heard her footsteps leaving, heard the door lock behind her. We waited in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside. Some of the younger girls were crying quietly. I thought about calling out, about trying to comfort them, but I was too afraid to break the silence rule even in the dark. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. Then I smelled it. Smoke, faint at first, just a hint of something burning, but growing stronger. "Do you smell that?" Someone whispered. "Fire," another voice said, panic rising. "There's a fire." The smell grew thicker. We could hear crackling now, somewhere close. Someone started screaming, others joined in. We rushed to the door, pulling on it desperately, but it was locked from the outside. Sister Margaret had locked us in, standard procedure at night, and now we were trapped. The smoke began seeping under the door, curling into our room like ghostly fingers. Girls were coughing, crying, pounding on the door and screaming for help. Through the window, I could see orange light flickering in another part of the building. The fire was spreading fast, fed by old dry wood and years of neglect. We were going to die here, I realized with strange calm. After years of surviving Sister Catherine's cruelty, we were going to burn to death because someone had locked frightened children in a room during a fire. Mary had gotten the quicker death after all. Then I heard footsteps running, heavy and fast. Someone was fumbling with the lock. The door burst open, and Sister Agnes stood there, her face lit by the flames spreading down the hallway behind her. "Out," she screamed. "Everyone out now." She grabbed the nearest girls and shoved them toward the stairs. "Stay low. Cover your mouths, go, go, go. 20 terrified children stampeded toward safety, coughing and crying but moving. Sister Agnes counted us frantically as we passed, making sure she had everyone. I was near the back, and as I reached the door, I saw Sister Margaret appear at the end of the hallway, her face twisted with rage. "What are you doing?" she shrieked at Sister Agnes. "You have no authority to." Sister Agnes cut her off. They were locked in a burning building. "I'm saving their lives." Sister Margaret moved to block the stairs. "Get back to your room, all of you. This is a minor fire, under control, and you're causing panic. Dot 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 dot. There was no time for arguments because the ceiling behind us exploded in a shower of burning timber. The fire had reached the support beams, and St. Catherine's, built over a century ago, from ancient wood and furnished with decades of equally ancient materials, was going up like kindling. Sister Agnes grabbed my hand and Sister Margaret's arm, dragging us both toward the stairs. The three of us tumbled down with the last of the children, the heat at our backs so intense I thought my skin would blister. We burst out through the front doors into the storm, rain soaking us instantly, and I've never been so grateful for cold water in my life. The other children were huddled on the lawn, watching St. Catherine's burn. Flames engulfed the windows we'd looked through for years, consuming the dormitory where Mary had died, the chapel where we'd prayed until our knees bled, Father Joseph's study where innocence had been stolen. The bell tower, outlined in fire against the black sky, looked like a beacon to hell itself. Somewhere inside, someone was ringing the bell, over and over. A desperate alarm that brought no help because there was no help to bring. The nearest fire department was 30 minutes away, and in that time, St. Catherine's would be ash. More people emerged from the building, nuns in their nightclothes, coughing and stumbling. Father Joseph appeared, his silver hair wild, his face smudged with soot, carrying an armful of ledgers and papers. Even in the chaos, even with his life's work burning around him, he'd gone back for the financial records. Some of the groundskeepers and kitchen staff made it out. We counted heads frantically, trying to figure out who was missing. Sister Agnes kept moving among us, checking for injuries, making sure the younger children weren't going into shock from cold and fear. That's when we heard the sirens, not just fire trucks, but police cars, their lights flashing red and blue through the rain. They came roaring up the long drive, far more vehicles than a simple fire would warrant. The fire trucks went to work immediately, though it was clear St. Catherine's was beyond saving. But the police cars parked in a semicircle, and officers emerged, moving toward Father Joseph and Sister Margaret with purpose. I heard one of them say, "We received documentation 3 days ago, allegations of child abuse and financial fraud. We were coming tomorrow to investigate, but it seems circumstances have accelerated our timeline." Father Joseph's face went white. Sister Margaret tried to run, actually turned and started running toward the woods, but 2 officers caught her easily. In the chaos and rain and firelight, with smoke billowing into the storm-torn sky, I watched the monsters who'd ruled our lives get handcuffed and led to police cars. Father Joseph was shouting about religious persecution, about his rights, about how they couldn't touch a man of God. But the officers weren't listening. They'd seen Sister Agnes's documentation, had read the testimonies of abused children, had studied the financial records showing years of donation money diverted into private accounts. The fire might have been an accident, started by candles during the power outage, but it had illuminated crimes that had festered in darkness for decades. We children were loaded into vehicles, some police cars but mostly civilian cars belonging to officers and firefighters who looked at us with pity and anger. Blankets appeared from somewhere, warm and dry. Someone handed me a cup of hot chocolate, the first truly sweet thing I'd tasted in 3 years. I sat in the back of a police car, watching St. Catherine's collapse in on itself, the bell tower finally falling in a cascade of sparks and flame. Next to me, a girl named Sophie was crying, not from fear but from relief. "It's over," she kept whispering. "It's really over." I wanted to believe her, but I'd learned not to trust hope. Hope led to disappointment. Hope got you hurt. They took us to a hospital in the nearest city, a 2-hour drive through mountain roads, made treacherous by the storm. Doctors and nurses examined us under bright lights, their faces growing tighter and angrier as they documented our malnutrition, our untreated injuries, our scars. A kind nurse with gray hair braided mine while asking gentle questions about my life at St. Catherine's. I couldn't answer at first. My voice seemed to have disappeared, but slowly, haltingly, I started talking. Once I started, I couldn't stop. 3 years of silence came pouring out in a flood of words and tears. The nurse held me while I sobbed, rocking me like Mama used to do when I was small and had nightmares. They called my parents the next morning. I was terrified to see them, convinced they'd be angry that I'd gotten St. Catherine's in trouble, that I'd exposed the church's sins. But when Mama and Papa burst into my hospital room, they looked broken. Mama fell to her knees beside my bed, grabbing my hands and crying so hard she couldn't speak. Papa stood behind her with tears streaming down his weathered face. "We didn't know," Mama kept saying. "Oh, Sarah, baby, we didn't know. They told us you were learning and growing in faith. They sent letters saying how well you were doing. We thought we were giving you a better life. We didn't know." It took me a long time to forgive them. Part of me stayed angry for years, furious that they'd trusted strangers over their own instincts, that they'd sent me away to survive alone in hell. But as I grew older, I understood their position better. They'd been desperate, poor, faithful people who believed the church would protect their child. They'd been lied to, just like we'd been lied to. Father Joseph had cultivated a reputation of holiness and care while running a prison for children. My parents were victims too, in their way. They had to live with the knowledge that their trust had nearly killed their daughter. The aftermath of St. Catherine's fire consumed months. The investigation uncovered even worse than Sister Agnes had documented. Financial records showed years of embezzlement. Medical examinations of the children revealed systematic abuse and neglect. Some children had broken bones that had healed wrong because they'd never received medical care. Others had trauma so deep that they couldn't speak about it, their silence more damning than any testimony. Several children had died over the years, their deaths recorded as natural or accidental but looking increasingly suspicious under investigation. Mary's death was ruled as negligent homicide. They'd let her die to save the cost of a doctor's visit. Father Joseph and Sister Margaret were prosecuted along with 3 other staff members. The trials were big news in our region, scandalous enough to make papers across the country. People were horrified that such cruelty could happen in a religious institution, though others defended the church, insisting these were isolated bad actors and not representative of faith institutions overall. I was called to testify at Father Joseph's trial. I was 11 years old, sitting in a courtroom full of adults, and I had to describe what he'd done to me in his study. My voice shook so badly, I could barely get the words out, but I did it. For Mary, for all of us who'd survived, for the ones who hadn't. Father Joseph was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison. He never showed remorse, insisted until the end that he'd done nothing wrong, that he'd been serving God. Sister Margaret got 15 years. The other staff members received various sentences. St. Catherine's property was seized by the state, though there wasn't much left after the fire. The ruins sat there for years afterward, a blackened shell of stone walls and charred timber, slowly being reclaimed by the mountain. Eventually, the state tore down what remained and turned the land into a small park, but for a long time, those ruins stood as a testament to what had happened. A memorial made of ash. Sister Agnes left the convent after the trials concluded. She told me she couldn't reconcile what she'd witnessed with her understanding of the church. Her faith had been shattered along with ours, but unlike many who lose faith and become bitter, Sister Agnes channeled her pain into action. She became a social worker, dedicating her life to protecting vulnerable children. She advocated for better oversight of religious institutions, for mandatory reporting laws, for systems that would prevent another St. Catherine's from existing in silence. She saved us twice, really, once from the fire, and once by refusing to let our suffering be forgotten. Recovery was slow and complicated. I went home to Mama and Papa, back to the farmhouse I'd left at 7. But I wasn't the same child who'd left. I had nightmares every night, waking up screaming about fires and locked doors and heavy footsteps in dark hallways. I couldn't stand to be touched unexpectedly. Loud noises made me flinch. I refused to go to church, couldn't even look at a crucifix without feeling sick. Mama tried to understand, but she didn't know how to help me. Mental health care for traumatized children wasn't common in rural areas in the 1950s. We didn't have words like PTSD yet. People just said I needed time to adjust, that I'd heal with patience and prayer. The prayer part I couldn't manage, but time did help. Slowly, I threw myself into school, finding safety in learning. Books became my refuge, stories my escape. I was behind academically after years of St. Catherine's inadequate education. But I caught up quickly, driven by a desperate need to prove I was more than what had been done to me. My teachers noticed my intensity, my fierce focus. They nurtured it, giving me extra books to read, encouraging my writing, helping me see that I had a future beyond my past. By high school, I'd decided I wanted to help children like me. I wanted to be the adult I'd needed at St. Catherine's. The other survivors scattered across the country, each finding their own path to healing or not healing. Some did well, building lives and families, transforming their trauma into strength. Others struggled with addiction, mental illness, the lasting scars of what we'd endured. A few didn't make it, succumbing to suicide or self-destructive behavior that stemmed from wounds that never properly healed. We'd been children when we entered St. Catherine's, and we emerged as something else entirely, old souls in young bodies, carrying knowledge no child should possess. I stayed in touch with Sophie, the girl who'd cried beside me in the police car that night. She moved to California with a foster family and became a teacher, pouring all her protective instincts into her students. We wrote letters back and forth for years, sharing our progress and setbacks, reminding each other that we'd survived and that survival meant something. On hard days, when the memories threatened to pull me under, I'd read her letters and remember that I wasn't alone in this struggle. We'd been through hell together, and somehow, we were building lives anyway. When I was 18, I received a letter from Sister Agnes. She'd been tracking down as many of the St. Catherine's survivors as she could find, wanting to know we were okay, offering help if we needed it. Her letter to me was full of warmth and genuine care. She told me about her work with Child Protective Services, about the new laws being passed to protect children in institutional care. She told me she thought about us every day, that saving us from that fire had been both the easiest and hardest thing she'd ever done. Easy because the choice was obvious. Hard because she wished she'd acted sooner, before Mary and others had died. I wrote back immediately, telling her she'd given me something precious that night, the knowledge that some adults could be trusted, that goodness existed even in dark places, that courage mattered. Sister Agnes and I maintained a correspondence that lasted decades. She came to my high school graduation, sitting in the audience with Mama and Papa, cheering when I walked across the stage. She was there when I graduated from college with a degree in social work, following in her footsteps. She attended my wedding when I married Tom, a gentle man who knew my history and loved me anyway, who understood why some days I couldn't bear to be touched and why churches made me physically ill. Sister Agnes held my first baby in the hospital, tears streaming down her face as she whispered blessings over my daughter that had nothing to do with formal religion and everything to do with love and hope. Becoming a mother changed something fundamental in me. Holding my daughter, feeling her tiny fingers wrap around mine, I was overwhelmed by a fierce protective instinct that made me understand my parents better. They'd thought they were protecting me by sending me to St. Catherine's. They'd been wrong, catastrophically wrong. But the impulse had come from love. I'd carried anger toward them for so long, but becoming a parent myself softened those edges. I saw how easy it is to make terrible mistakes when you're desperate and afraid. I saw how trust can be weaponized by people who wear masks of authority and holiness. I forgave them fully then, not just in words, but in my heart. I worked as a social worker for 30 years, specializing in cases involving institutional abuse. I became the person who asked uncomfortable questions, who pushed for investigations, who believed children when they reported abuse. I was difficult to work with sometimes. My colleagues said, too aggressive, too unwilling to give authority figures the benefit of the doubt. But I'd learned at St. Catherine's that benefit of the doubt could cost children their lives. I'd rather be difficult and save a child than polite and complicit. Some people called me militant. I called myself vigilant. There's a difference. Over the years, I returned to the site of St. Catherine's a few times. The first visit was the hardest. I was 25, newly married, and Tom drove me up the mountain road on a crisp autumn day. The ruins were still there then, though nature was beginning to reclaim them. Ivy covered the remaining stone walls. Small trees grew through what had been the chapel floor. The bell tower was gone, but its foundation remained, a circular scar on the earth. I walked through the space where our dormitory had stood, where Mary had died, where we'd spent so many terrified nights. I expected to feel overwhelmed by memories, to break down. Instead, I felt strangely peaceful. This place had no power over me anymore. It was just stone and ash and ghosts that couldn't hurt me. I found the small cemetery behind where the main building had stood. Most of the wooden crosses had rotted away or fallen over, but I could still make out the disturbed earth-marking graves. One counted 15 small mounds, 15 children who'd died at St. Catherine's over the years it had operated. I knelt in the overgrown grass and spoke to them, to Mary especially. I told them they hadn't been forgotten. I told them what had happened to Father Joseph and Sister Margaret, how justice had finally found them. I told them that some of us had survived and were living full lives, that their suffering hadn't been meaningless because it had sparked changes that protected other children. I left wildflowers on each grave, 15 small bouquets that would wilt and die, but that felt necessary anyway. Before I left that day, I found Sister Agnes's contact information carved into a tree near the cemetery entrance. She'd been there too, I realized, coming back to remember and honor the children we'd lost. Seeing her careful handwriting in the bark made me cry for the first time that day. She'd carried her guilt for not saving everyone, even though she'd done more than any other adult to help us. I made a note to write to her when I got home, to tell her again that she'd been our miracle, that she didn't need to carry blame for deaths that happened before she arrived, or despite her best efforts. The second time I visited was years later, after they'd cleared the ruins and created the small park. It looked completely different, carefully manicured grass and walking paths, benches positioned to enjoy the mountain view, a small playground for children. A plaque near the entrance gave the barest facts. This had been the site of St. Catherine's Church School, which operated from 1920 to 1955 and was destroyed by fire. It mentioned that the site was now dedicated to the memory of children who deserved better care than they received. It was sanitized history, uncomfortable details smoothed away, but at least it was something. At least there was acknowledgement. I sat on one of the benches that day, watching children play on the playground where our hell had stood. Their laughter felt like healing, like the land itself was being redeemed by joy after so much sorrow. An elderly woman sat down beside me, and we started talking the way strangers sometimes do. She mentioned she was visiting the area and had stopped at this park to rest. She asked if I knew the history of the place. I told her I did. I told her everything. She listened with growing horror, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "How did you survive that? How did you move past it?" I thought about my answer carefully. I didn't move past it, I finally said. I moved forward with it. There's a difference. The past is always there, but I don't let it be the only thing that defines me. Now, I'm 73 years old, sitting in my living room with afternoon sunlight warming my shoulders, and I can look back on my life with something approaching peace. The nightmares still come occasionally, less frequent now but no less vivid when they do. I still can't attend church services without feeling anxious and trapped. I still flinch at unexpected loud noises. St. Catherine's left marks on my soul that never completely healed. But I built a good life anyway. I had a marriage of 47 years to a man who loved me fiercely and gently. I raised 3 children who grew into kind, strong adults. I worked a career that mattered, that helped protect vulnerable kids. I had friendships and laughter and moments of pure joy that the scared little girl locked in that dormitory never could have imagined. Sister Agnes passed away 5 years ago at the age of 92. I was with her at the end, holding her hand in the hospice room while she drifted in and out of consciousness. In one of her lucid moments, she looked at me with those same gentle eyes and said, "Did I do enough?" I leaned close and told her the truth. "You saved us. You gave us a chance at life. You did more than enough." She smiled then, a real smile of relief and peace, and closed her eyes. She died 2 days later, and I spoke at her funeral, telling everyone gathered there about her courage, her compassion, her willingness to stand up against corruption even when it cost her everything she'd known. The church was packed with people whose lives she'd touched, children she'd protected, policies she'd influenced, a legacy of care that rippled out far beyond St. Catherine's. At her funeral, I reconnected with several other St. Catherine's survivors I'd lost touch with over the years. We stood together afterward, 7 women in our 60s and 70s, looking at each other and seeing both the children we'd been and the adults we'd become. We'd all taken different paths, carried our trauma differently, healed in different ways, but we shared something profound that no one else could fully understand. We'd survived together. We exchanged contact information, made promises to stay in touch that we actually kept this time. We created a small, informal group, meeting once a year on the anniversary of the fire, supporting each other through the hard days that still came. My grandchildren sometimes ask me about my childhood. They know I have scars, have seen the way I react to certain things, have heard fragments of stories over the years. Last week, my youngest granddaughter, Sophie, named after my old friend, asked me directly, "Grandma, what happened to you when you were little? Why don't you like churches?" She's 14, old enough to understand, and I've been thinking about how to answer her. So I decided to tell her everything, the full story from beginning to end, not to traumatize her, but because I want her to understand that surviving terrible things is possible, that speaking truth matters even when it's uncomfortable, that institutions and authority figures aren't automatically trustworthy just because they claim to be. I want her to know that her grandmother was once a powerless child in an impossible situation, but that child found strength she didn't know she had. I want her to understand that faith can be twisted into a weapon, but that doesn't mean compassion and justice are meaningless. I want her to recognize the signs of abuse and manipulation so she can protect herself and others. I want her to know about people like Sister Agnes, ordinary humans who become heroes by simply refusing to look away from suffering. I want her to carry our history forward, to be the kind of person who asks questions and stands up and protects the vulnerable. So I'm telling her this story, all of it, holding nothing back except the specific details that would be too graphic for her young ears. I'm telling her about the cold dormitory and the thin soup and the locked doors. I'm telling her about Mary's death and Father Joseph's crimes and Sister Margaret's cruelty. I'm telling her about the fire that finally freed us, about Sister Agnes breaking down doors, about the storm and the sirens and the building collapsing behind us. I'm telling her about the long aftermath, the trials and the healing, and the work I've done since. I'm telling her that trauma doesn't have to be the end of your story, that you can build beautiful things from broken pieces. Sophie listens without interrupting, her young face serious and sad but also thoughtful. When I finish, she's quiet for a long moment. Then she asks, "Do you still believe in God, Grandma?" It's the question everyone eventually asks, as if faith is the measure of whether I survived intact. I think about my answer, wanting to be honest. I don't believe in the God they taught me about at St. Catherine's. I say slowly, that God was cruel and arbitrary and demanded suffering as proof of devotion, but I believe in something bigger than us, something that moves through people like Sister Agnes and compels them toward goodness. I believe in love and justice and the human capacity for courage. If that's God, then yes, I believe. But I don't need a church building or a priest to find those things. I find them in people, in acts of kindness, in the choice to help someone even when it's hard. Sophie nods, processing this, then she says something that makes my throat tight with emotion. "I want to be like Sister Agnes when I grow up. I want to be someone who helps people and stands up to bad guys." I pull her into a hug. This beautiful girl who carries my friend's name and now carries forward a legacy of protection. "Then you will be," I tell her, "and I'll help you learn how." After Sophie leaves, I sit alone in the growing dusk, watching the sun set through my living room window. I'm thinking about the long, strange journey from that terrified 7-year-old arriving at St. Catherine's to this 73-year-old grandmother who survived to tell the tale. The road wasn't straight or easy. There were years I didn't think I'd make it, nights I didn't want to see morning, moments when the weight of memory felt too heavy to carry. But I kept going, one day at a time, because that's what survivors do. We endure, we adapt, we find meaning in our suffering by using it to protect others. I walked to my bookshelf and pulled down an old leather journal, the one Sister Agnes gave me years ago. Inside are photographs of the St. Catherine's survivors I've kept track of, newspaper clippings about the trials, copies of letters we've exchanged over the decades, the program from Sister Agnes's funeral. There's a photograph of Mary that someone's mother had provided during the investigation. A little girl with freckles and a bright smile, frozen forever at 9 years old. I touch her face gently, still missing her after all these years, still wishing she'd survived to see how the story ended. But maybe, in a way, she did survive. Maybe we carry our dead with us, their memories woven into who we become. Mary's death radicalized me, turned me into someone who would never look away from injustice, never accept authority without question, never let a child's suffering go unnoticed. Every child I helped in my career was me helping Mary retroactively, saving her over and over by saving others. Maybe that's how we honor the dead, by living in ways that make their suffering mean something. On the last page of the journal, I've written something I read once and never forgot. The opposite of trauma isn't peace, it's purpose. For me, that's been true. I didn't find peace by forgetting or minimizing what happened. I found it by channeling everything St. Catherine's taught me, both the horror and the resilience it forced me to develop, into work that mattered. I found it by speaking truth, by refusing to let shame silence me, by turning my pain into protection for others. I found it in the relationships I built, the love I gave and received, the ordinary beautiful moments of a life well lived, despite everything. People sometimes tell me I'm inspiring, that my survival is remarkable. I don't feel inspiring most days. I feel like someone who did what she had to do to keep living. Nothing heroic about it, just the stubborn human refusal to let cruelty have the final word. But if my story helps someone else who's struggling with trauma, if it gives them hope that healing is possible even when it's not complete, if it reminds them that they're not alone in their suffering, then maybe there's value in telling it. Maybe that's part of the purpose I've found. Tomorrow, I'm visiting the park where St. Catherine's once stood. It's become a yearly pilgrimage for me, a way of marking time and remembering. Some years I go alone, sitting quietly with my memories. Other years, other survivors join me, and we share stories and tears and sometimes even laughter, remembering the kids we were and celebrating the adults we became. This year, Sophie asked if she could come with me. She wants to see the place, to understand more fully where her grandmother's story unfolded. I said yes, because bearing witness is important, because history shouldn't be sanitized, because the next generation needs to know what happened so they can prevent it from happening again. I'm packing a bag now, putting in things I'll bring tomorrow: flowers for the cemetery, a copy of the memorial plaque text, photographs of the survivors to show Sophie who we all became. I'm including a letter I wrote years ago but never sent, addressed to my 7-year-old self on that rainy morning when Mama packed my suitcase. In it, I tell her that the road ahead is hard, harder than she can imagine, but that she's stronger than she knows. I tell her about Mary and Sister Agnes and the fire that sets her free. I tell her about Tom and her children and her career and her grandchildren. I tell her that she survives, that she builds a life, that she finds meaning in the mess. I tell her that she's going to be okay. I'm not sure why I wrote that letter. Maybe because I needed to hear those words myself. Needed to remind myself that I did survive. I did build something meaningful. I did become more than what was done to me. Maybe because sometimes we need to mother ourselves, to give our younger selves the reassurance and protection they never received. Maybe because healing is partly about integrating all the versions of yourself, the traumatized child and the surviving adult, into one coherent story that acknowledges both the pain and the triumph. As I pack, I find myself thinking about faith again. That question Sophie asked. The faith I lost at St. Catherine's was blind trust. The belief that authority figures and institutions were inherently good because they claimed connection to the divine. That faith needed to die. It was dangerous and naive. But in its place, I've developed something else, something harder won and more resilient. I have faith in people's capacity to change and grow. I have faith in the power of truth to eventually emerge, no matter how deeply it's buried. I have faith that love and courage and simple human decency are stronger than cruelty and corruption. Not because they always win immediately, but because they endure. I have faith because I lived through St. Catherine's and came out the other side. I have faith because Sister Agnes chose to break down doors rather than follow unjust rules. I have faith because Mary smiled even in that terrible place, because Sophie named her daughter after a lost friend, because survivors kept getting up every morning even when getting up felt impossible. I have faith because my granddaughter wants to grow up to protect people, because every generation has its defenders and helpers, because the human impulse toward compassion is as persistent as the impulse toward cruelty. This faith isn't comfortable or certain. It's tested constantly, strained by news of ongoing abuse and corruption, and systems that still fail vulnerable people. But it's mine, earned through fire and survival, and no one can take it from me, the way Father Joseph took so much else. It's a faith that requires action, not just belief. It demands that I stay vigilant, Keep speaking up, continue protecting. It's exhausting sometimes, but it's also what gives my life meaning. It's the answer to Sister Agnes's deathbed question. Yes, we did enough, because we tried, because we refused to be silent, because we turned our trauma into a tool for change. The sun has fully set now, and my living room is dark except for the lamp beside my chair. Tomorrow I'll drive up that mountain road again, this time with my granddaughter beside me, and I'll show her where monsters once lived and where courage defeated them. I'll show her the playground built on top of old nightmares, the benches where strangers rest without knowing the ground's history, the small cemetery where children who deserved so much better found their final rest. I'll tell her about the night the fire came and how Sister Agnes saved us and how sometimes destruction is necessary before rebuilding can begin. And I'll tell her what I've learned in 73 years of carrying this story, that you can survive the unsurvivable, that you can build beauty from ashes, that speaking truth matters, even when your voice shakes, that love and protection are choices we make every day, that healing isn't about forgetting but about integrating and moving forward. I'll tell her that her grandma was once a powerless child who became a powerful woman, not through revenge or bitterness, but through the simple, stubborn decision to help others, to bear witness, to refuse to let cruelty define her story. I'll tell her that the opposite of trauma isn't the absence of pain, it's the presence of purpose. It's waking up each morning and choosing to engage with life despite the scars. It's building relationships and communities and systems that protect the vulnerable. It's passing on the lessons learned so that future generations can recognize danger and respond with courage. It's remembering the lost without being destroyed by the memory. It's honoring survivors by creating a world where fewer children need to learn survival in the first place. And then I'll take her hand, this precious girl who represents everything St. Catherine's tried to destroy and everything I fought to preserve, and we'll walk together through that park where evil once thrived, but where children now play freely. We'll plant new flowers on old graves. We'll speak names that haven't been spoken in decades. We'll cry and remember and rage and grieve, and then we'll leave, driving back down the mountain to homes where children are safe and loved, carrying our history with us but not letting it crush us. Survivors and witnesses and defenders of the vulnerable. One generation teaching the next that courage matters, that kindness matters, that standing up to institutional evil matters, that every voice raised against injustice matters. The fire came for St. Catherine's on a storm-torn night in 1955, and it burned away the building, but it couldn't burn away the truth. That truth lives on in all of us who survived, in the work we've done, in the children we've protected, in the stories we've told. They tried to break us in that terrible place, tried to teach us that suffering was holy, and silence was safe and authority was absolute, but they failed. We're still here, still speaking, still protecting, still believing in a better world, and that, more than anything else, is the real miracle. Not the fire that freed us, but the fact that we refused to be destroyed by what came before it. We survived, we thrived, we built lives worth living, and that's the ending they never saw coming.